She shared her last meal with a stranger. She did not know he was the Duke. She did not know he was the man who had publicly rejected her 3 years ago, the man whose name she had scrubbed from her memory like a wound she could not afford to keep open. She sat across from him in the dim light of a roadside inn, a single bowl of soup between them, and she had no idea that the fate of an entire kingdom was about to turn on the simple act of breaking bread with a ghost. Her name was Elara. She had been a servant in the Duke's household, invisible, obedient, a shadow among shadows. She had loved him in silence for 2 years, loved him with the desperate, consuming love of a woman who knew she was beneath him, but could not stop her heart from beating his name. And he had noticed her once, only once, on a night when the moon was full and the wine had loosened his restraint. He had taken her in the garden, rough and urgent, and she had given herself to him knowing it was the only time she would ever be held by a man like him. She had not expected tenderness. She had not expected to matter, and when the morning came, and he looked at her as if she were a stain on his sheets, she had understood her place. But she had not expected the child. 3 years had passed since that night. 3 years of hiding, of working in kitchens and laundries, of watching her belly swell and her heart harden. She had named the boy after her father, a fisherman who had drowned before she was 10. She had raised him alone in a cottage on the edge of the Duke's estate, a cottage he did not know existed. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her humiliation, carved a life out of nothing, learned to smile again, and now, on a cold autumn evening, she found herself seated across from the man who had destroyed her, and he did not recognize her face. He was traveling alone, without retinue, without the gold-trimmed coat that marked his station. He wore plain wool, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow in a way that suggested he had not slept in days. He had stopped at the inn because his horse had gone lame, and the innkeeper had told him there was no room, only a bench near the fire where a woman and a child were eating their supper. He had sat down without asking, without looking at her, and the innkeeper had brought a second bowl, placed it between them, and the Duke had begun to eat as if he had not tasted food in a year. Elara's hands trembled as she lifted her spoon. She kept her eyes down, her hood pulled low, her breath shallow. The boy, her son, sat on her lap, quiet and watchful, his small fingers wrapped around a piece of bread. The Duke did not look at him. He did not look at her. He stared into the fire as if it held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. And then he spoke. His voice, the same voice she had heard whisper her name in the darkness of the garden, rasped out into the silence. "Is this your first winter here?" She did not answer immediately. She forced herself to breathe, to swallow, to think. "No," she said, her voice steady, a voice she had trained to sound like a stranger. "I have been here many seasons." "It is cold," he said, as if the observation required no response. "Colder than I remember." She nodded. The fire crackled. The boy shifted on her lap, and the Duke's eyes flickered to him for a single moment, then returned to the flames. He did not see the resemblance. He did not see the shape of his own jaw in the child's face, the curve of his own brow in the child's forehead. He saw only a servant woman and her son, 2 figures too insignificant to hold his gaze. If he had looked longer, he would have seen his own eyes staring back at him. She finished her soup in silence. She rose, gathered the boy against her chest, and walked toward the door. She did not look back. She could not look back, because if she looked back, she would see the man she had loved, and the love would undo her all over again. She stepped into the freezing night, the wind cutting through her thin cloak, and she told herself that it was over, that she had survived him once, and she would survive him again, that the Duke of Ashworth was nothing more than a stranger, with hollow eyes and a bowl of soup between them. She was wrong. He had not recognized her face, but he had recognized something else, the way she held her shoulders, the way she walked as if she were leaving behind something she could not bear to carry, the way the child had looked at him, with eyes that held a question no boy that age should know how to ask. And the next morning, when the innkeeper told him that the woman had left before dawn, heading east toward the coast, the Duke of Ashworth did something he had not done in 3 years. He followed. He did not know why. He told himself it was curiosity, the idle impulse of a man whose life had become a hollow repetition of duties and obligations. He told himself it was nothing, a momentary distraction, a whim that would fade by midday. But he followed, his horse's hooves beating against the frozen road, the wind biting at his face, and he could not shake the feeling that he was chasing something he had lost long ago. He caught up with her at a crossroads, where the road divided between the coast and the capital. She was standing with the child in her arms, staring at the signpost, as if the name of one destination could erase the memory of another. He dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the frost, and when she turned to face him, he saw her eyes for the first time in full daylight. He stopped. The recognition did not come as a shock, but as a slow unraveling, a thread pulled from a fabric he had thought was sealed forever. He saw the shape of her cheekbones, the curve of her lips, the way her hair fell across her forehead exactly as it had fallen on the night in the garden. And he saw, in the child's face, his own image staring back at him, with the unblinking certainty of truth. "You," he said. The word was not an accusation, it was not a question. It was the sound of a man who had just realized that the ghost he had been chasing for 3 years had been sitting across from him at a roadside inn, sharing a bowl of soup, and he had let her walk away. She did not run. She did not flinch. She stood her ground, the child pressed against her chest, and she looked at him with eyes that held no fear. "My lord," she said, and the formality of the address cut him deeper than any insult could have. "You disappeared," he said, 3 years ago. "You disappeared without a word." "You told me to forget," she said. "I was obeying your command." He had no answer. The memory of that morning, the morning after the garden, the way he had looked at her as if she were nothing, the way he had told her to leave and never speak of what had happened, it all came rushing back, cold and unforgiving. He had been cruel. He had been a coward. He had sent her away because he could not face the truth of what he felt, because feeling something for a servant was a weakness a duke could not afford. "The boy," he said, "is he mine?" She did not answer. She looked down at the child, at the eyes that were already watching the duke with a curiosity that mirrored his own, and she pressed her lips into a thin line. "He has no father." "He has a father," the duke said, the words scraping out of him like broken glass. "He has a father who did not know, a father who was told nothing, a father who has spent 3 years wandering from one meaningless duty to the next, hollow and empty and searching for something he could not name." She looked up at him then, and he saw that her eyes were wet. "You had your chance," she said. "You chose your title. You chose your pride. You chose to pretend I never existed, and I survived. I built a life. I raised a son. You do not get to walk back into that life because you happened to sit down at the wrong table on the wrong night. It was not wrong," he said. "It was the first right thing that has happened to me in years." She shook her head. "You do not get to rewrite history, my lord. You do not get to turn a coincidence into fate." He stepped closer. She did not step back. The child, his child, looked up at him with those impossible eyes, and the Duke of Ashworth, the coldest man in the kingdom, felt something break inside his chest. "I am not here to rewrite history," he said. "I am here to beg for a future." The wind howled between them. The signpost creaked. The road stretched in both directions, offering escape on one side and return on the other. And Ilara, the woman who had loved him and been broken by him, stood at the center of the crossroads holding his son in her arms and did not know which way to turn. She was saved from having to decide by the sound of hoofbeats. A rider approached from the direction of the capital, a messenger in the Duke's livery, his face flushed with cold and urgency. He reined in before the Duke, dropped to one knee and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of catastrophe. "My lord, you must return at once. The king has summoned the council. The wedding, it has been moved forward. The bride has arrived." The Duke's face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks, from his lips, from the hollows of his eyes. He looked at Ilara, and she saw in his expression something she had never seen before. Fear. Real, unfiltered fear. The kind that came not from external threat, but from the knowledge that he was about to lose everything he had only just realized he wanted. The Duke stands at a crossroads, a child he never knew in his arms, and now the wedding bell tolls for another woman. How will he choose between duty and the family he just discovered? If you want to follow every twist of this shattered love story, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Ilara learns the full truth. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were the Duke? Would you return to the capital or walk away with Ilara and your child? "What wedding?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He did not speak. He did not have to. The messenger, oblivious to the scene he had interrupted, filled the silence with words that fell like stones into still water. "The Duke is to marry Lady Marguerite of Harrowfield. The ceremony has been set for 3 days hence. The king has commanded your presence." And there it was. The truth she had known all along, the truth she had tried to bury beneath the hope that flickered in her chest when he had said he came to beg for a future. He was not free. He had never been free. He was a duke, bound to a world of alliances and obligations, and she was a servant who had shared a bowl of soup with a stranger. She turned. She walked toward the eastern road, the road to the coast, the road that led away from everything he represented. She did not look back. She heard him call her name, once, twice, a third time, each repetition more desperate than the last. She kept walking. She held her son tighter. She told herself that she had survived this before, and she would survive it again. But the child looked over her shoulder, his small eyes fixed on the man who had fathered him, and the boy's lips parted as if to speak a word he had never been taught. The Duke saw it. He saw his own reflection in that small face, and he knew with a certainty that cut through the fog of his fear that he could not let them walk away. He mounted his horse. He did not ride toward the capital. He did not ride toward the wedding, toward the king, toward the bride who was waiting for him in a castle of gilded cages. He rode east toward the coast, toward the woman and child who carried his blood and his future, and the only truth that had ever mattered. The messenger shouted after him, calling him a madman, calling him a traitor, calling him every name that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Duke did not stop. He did not slow. He rode as if the hounds of the underworld were at his heels, and in a way they were, because behind him was a life of privilege and emptiness, a marriage to a woman he did not love, a throne of cold stone and colder duty. Ahead of him was a woman who had no reason to trust him, and a child who did not know his name. He rode as if his life depended on catching her. And when he reached her, at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, with the wind tearing at his coat and the salt spray freezing on his cheeks, he dismounted, fell to his knees, and said the words he had never said to anyone. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I am not asking you to forget what I did. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life becoming the man you deserved from the beginning." She stood with her back to him, her silhouette outlined against the grey sea, the child asleep in her arms. She did not turn. She did not speak. The only sound was the crash of waves against the rocks below, the cry of gulls circling overhead, the ragged breath of a duke who had finally learned what it cost to love someone more than himself. And then she spoke, and her voice carried across the wind with a weight that made him feel for the first time like he was the one standing on the edge of a cliff. "You are to be married in 3 days. I will cancel it. The king commands your presence. I will defy the king. The kingdom will call you a traitor. Let them." She turned then, and he saw her face, tear-streaked and fierce and more beautiful than any painting in the castle. "And what of your bride? What of Lady Marguerite? Will you humiliate her as you humiliated me? Will you break another woman to prove you have changed?" The question struck him like a blade. He had not thought of that. He had thought only of himself, of his desperation, of the void that had opened inside him when he realized he could lose them again. He had not thought of the woman waiting at the altar, the woman who had done nothing wrong, the woman who would be left standing alone while the kingdom whispered her shame. He bowed his head. "I will speak to her myself. I will tell her the truth. I will give her the choice to walk away before I make the announcement. I will not make an enemy of her. I will make her an ally, a friend, a partner in a different kind of arrangement. I will do whatever it takes to undo the harm I have caused, even if it means spending the rest of my life paying for the harm I caused you." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and he saw in her eyes the same woman who had come to him in the garden, the same woman who had given him everything and received nothing in return. She was not the same. She had been hardened by loss, tempered by survival, sharpened into something that could not be broken again. "I cannot stop you from doing what you feel you must," she said, "but I will not be a prize you win by destroying someone else. If you want me, if you want your son, then you will find a way that does not leave another woman bleeding on the ground. You will clean the mess you made before you come to me again." She turned. She walked east, along the cliff's edge, toward a village that would take her in and ask no questions. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had given him the only answer that mattered, and whether he was strong enough to follow it was no longer her concern. The Duke watched her go. He did not chase her. He stood at the edge of the sea, the waves crashing below, and he made a vow that he would keep or die trying. He would cancel the wedding. He would speak to Lady Marguerite not as a suitor, but as a diplomat, offering her an alliance that protected her honor and her future. He would stand before the king and accept whatever punishment came with defying a royal command. He would strip himself of every privilege, every title, every protection, and he would come to Elara with nothing but his hands and his heart and the truth that he had loved her since the night he first saw her in the garden. It would take him 3 days to dismantle the life he had built. It would take him 3 days to make himself worthy of the woman he had wronged. But at the end of those 3 days, when the wedding that was meant to seal his fate instead collapsed into scandal, the Duke of Ashworth would stand at the same crossroads where he had found her, and he would not be chasing a ghost. He would be walking toward a future of his own making. It began with a bowl of soup, shared between strangers in the glow of a dying fire. It ended with a child's eyes, looking up at the father who had finally earned the right to be seen. But the hardest part, the reckoning, was yet to come. He returned to the capital that night, his coat still wet with sea spray, his mind a storm of plans and fears. The castle was awake when he arrived, torches burning along the walls, servants rushing to and fro in preparation for the wedding that was now less than 3 days away. He walked through the halls without seeing them, his steps carrying him not to his chambers, but to the chapel, where the altar was already draped in white silk and winter roses. He stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, and he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he was about to destroy. Lady Marguerite had done nothing wrong. She was a woman of good breeding, kind eyes, and a reputation that had never been touched by scandal. She had accepted this marriage not out of love but out of duty, and she had done so with grace. To break the engagement was to humiliate her, to tell her the truth, that he had fathered a child with a servant, that he was choosing that servant over her, was to wound her in a way that might never heal. He could not do it in a way that would spare her entirely, but he could do it in a way that honored her dignity, that gave her the agency to choose her own story. He would not abandon her at the altar. He would not make her the victim of a public spectacle. He would go to her tonight in private, and he would tell her everything. It took him an hour to find the courage. He knocked on the door of her chambers at midnight, and when she opened it, dressed in a simple gown, her hair loose around her shoulders, he saw that she had already been crying. She had heard rumors. She had seen the messenger return without him. She had known, in the way that women in her position always knew, that something had gone wrong. "You have come to break the engagement," she said, and it was not a question. He nodded. "I have come to tell you the truth." She invited him in. She poured 2 cups of wine, though neither of them drank. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady and sad, and she listened as he told her about the garden, about the servant, about the son he had never known. She listened as he described the moment of recognition at the crossroads, the ride to the cliff, the vow he had made to destroy everything he had built, to rebuild himself as a man worthy of forgiveness. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a wound that had not yet been dressed. "You love her," Lady Marguerite said. "Yes." "And the child, he is yours?" "Yes." She closed her eyes. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she opened them they were dry, though her voice trembled. "I am not angry," she said. "I am not even surprised. I have known since the moment I met you that you were a man carrying a ghost. I thought I could outshine it. I thought I could give you something that would make you forget. But ghosts do not forget. They wait, and they find you when you least expect it." He had no words. He simply sat there, empty and raw, letting her speak. "I will not stand in your way," she said. "I will tell the court that I have chosen to withdraw from the engagement, that I have realized my heart belongs elsewhere. I will give you a story that protects your honor and mine, and I will pray that the woman you are chasing is strong enough to forgive you, because you will need every ounce of her strength to become what she deserves." She stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, the lights flickering in the windows of the houses below. "But I want you to remember something, my lord. Every woman you have wronged has had to rebuild herself from the pieces you left behind. Your servant rebuilt herself in secret, alone, without anyone to hold her hand. I will rebuild myself in public, with the eyes of the kingdom upon me, and I will do it without showing a single tear." She turned back to him, and he saw that she was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. "Do not waste her forgiveness, and do not waste mine." He left her chambers with the weight of her grace crushing down on his chest. He walked through the empty halls, past the gilded portraits of ancestors who had never known the kind of love that broke a man open and rebuilt him from the inside. He went to the chapel, and he knelt before the altar, and he prayed to a God he was not sure he believed in, that he would be given the chance to become the man he had promised to be. The next day, the announcement came. Lady Marguerite had withdrawn from the engagement for personal reasons. The Duke of Ashworth had accepted her decision with honor. The king, furious and suspicious, summoned the Duke to the throne room and demanded an explanation. The Duke gave him one, stripped of all pretense. He told the king about the child. He told him about the woman. He told him that he would choose them over his title, over his lands, over the crown itself. The king listened in silence, his face unreadable, and when the Duke finished, the king leaned back on his throne and said nothing for a long, terrible moment. The Duke knelt in a chapel of stone, and confessed his sins to a God he barely believed in. That kind of vulnerability does not come often, and it does not come cheap. If you want to stay with him through this journey, through the ship, the reunion, and the reckoning, subscribe now so you do not miss a single beat of this redemption. And tell me in the comments, what word do you think the king was about to say as he leaned back on his throne? Honesty? Foolishness? Or something even more dangerous? "You are a fool," the king finally said. "But you are an honest fool. And I have seen enough liars in this court to know that honesty is the rarest currency of all. He did not strip the Duke of his title. He did not imprison him. He gave him 1 month to retrieve his family and return to the capital with a wedding that would be recognized by the crown. The Duke left the throne room with his heart pounding, his hands shaking, his mind already racing toward the coast. He had 1 month to find her, to convince her, to bring her back. 1 month to turn a broken road into a new beginning. He rode east at dawn, alone, without a single guard or servant. He carried no gold, no letters of introduction, no promises of power or wealth. He carried only the truth that he had finally learned to speak, and he hoped, with every fiber of his being, that it would be enough. The road to the coast wound through forests and fields, past villages that were just waking, past children who waved at the lone rider on the grey horse. He did not stop. He did not rest. He rode until the sun was high and then low, until the sky bled orange and purple, until he saw the sea glimmering in the distance and the smoke rising from the chimneys of a small fishing village. He found her at the edge of the village, in a cottage with a blue door and a garden of winter herbs. She was hanging laundry on a line, her son playing at her feet, the wind catching her hair and carrying it like a banner. When she saw him, she did not move. She simply watched him approach, her hands still on the wet cloth, her eyes unreadable. He dismounted. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, and he spoke before she could tell him to leave. "The wedding is cancelled. The king has given me 1 month to bring my family to the capital. Lady Marguerite has withdrawn with her honor intact. I have done everything you asked of me, and I have done it without destroying anyone else." He paused. He dropped to his knees in the mud of her garden, the wet earth soaking through his trousers, and he looked up at her with the eyes of a man who had finally learned to beg for nothing but the truth. "I am not here as a duke. I am not here with titles or land or promises of wealth. I am here as a man who has spent 3 years empty, 3 years lost, 3 years searching for something he was too blind to see when it was standing in front of him. I am here to ask you not to run from me again." She did not speak. She looked at him and he saw that her hands were shaking, that her lips were pressed together in the way that meant she was fighting tears. The child, their child, walked toward him, his small feet moving through the wet grass, and the boy stopped inches from his father's face and stared at him with eyes that had never seen a man kneel before. "What is your name?" the boy asked. The Duke's voice cracked. "Ashworth," he said. "My name is Ashworth." The boy looked at his mother, then back at the man on his knees. "My name is Thomas," he said, "after my grandfather." The Duke, Ashworth, felt the tears come. He did not hide them. He let them fall, because for the first time in his life, he was not ashamed of needing something so badly that it broke him open. Ilara walked toward him. She knelt in the mud beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his face, and when he looked at her, he saw that she was crying too. "You are late," she whispered. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry for every day I was late. I am sorry for every moment I let you carry the weight alone. I am sorry for every night I did not know you existed. Every morning I did not wake up beside you. Every breath I took that was not spent searching for you." She laughed, a broken sound that was half sob and half relief. "You are terrible at apologies." "I will practice," he said. "I will spend the rest of my life practicing." She pulled him into her arms, and he buried his face in her shoulder, and he felt the child, Thomas, press against his side, small and warm and real. He held them both, there in the mud of the garden, with the sea wind wrapping around them and the winter herbs crushed beneath their knees. He had come back from the dead. He had found his family. He had earned the right to begin. But the kingdom was watching. The king's month was ticking, and the road ahead was still tangled with secrets, scandals, and the weight of a past that would not let them go. He had 3 days to bring her to the capital, 3 days to face the court with a child and a servant bride, 3 days to turn scandal into legend, 3 days to prove that the man who had knelt in the mud was stronger than the Duke who had stood at the altar with a lie. He would need every one of them. They left the cottage at dawn, the three of them riding together on a single horse, the boy nestled between them, the sea fading behind them as the road wound inland. The Duke told her everything: the meeting with the king, the grace of Lady Marguerite, the month of grace given to him that felt like an uncertain reprieve. He did not hide the fear in his voice when he spoke of returning to the capital, of the whispers that would follow them, of the courtiers who would look at Ilara and see only a servant who had trapped a duke with a child. She listened without interrupting. She held Thomas steady as the horse picked its way along the frozen ruts of the road, and she did not flinch when he described the worst of it, the accusations that would come, the insults that would be whispered, the way the kingdom would try to tear them apart simply because they did not understand how a man like him could choose a woman like her. "You are afraid," she said, when he finally fell silent. He did not deny it. "I have faced battlefields. I have faced the king's wrath. I have faced men who wanted to see me dead, but I have never faced anything as terrifying as walking into that court with you and Thomas, knowing that every eye will be watching for a crack, a weakness, a reason to tear us apart." "Then do not give them a crack," she said. "Hold your head high. Hold my hand in front of them. Let them see that you are not ashamed of me, that you are not hiding from the truth. Let them see that the Duke of Ashworth has chosen his family over his pride, and that he does not regret it." He looked at her, and he saw that she was not afraid. She was not naive. She knew what awaited them. She had spent 3 years surviving, 3 years learning how to endure the cruelties of a world that had no place for her. She had faced hunger and cold and loneliness, and she had emerged from it with a spine of steel. The court of the capital, with all its sharp tongues and sharper knives, held no terror for her. She had already survived the worst of him. Everything else was just noise. They rode through the first day without stopping, sleeping that night in a barn that smelled of hay and horses, the three of them huddled together under a single blanket. The boy slept between them, his small body a bridge that neither of them crossed. Ilara lay awake, staring at the rafters, feeling the Duke's warmth at her back, and she allowed herself to imagine for the first time what it would mean to belong to someone again. She had not imagined it in 3 years. She had trained herself not to hope, not to reach for things that could be taken away, but now, with his breath warm against her neck and his hand resting lightly on her hip, she felt the walls she had built begin to crack. He felt her stiffen. He spoke into the darkness, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you thinking?" "That I do not know how to trust you," she said. "That I want to, but I do not know how." He did not try to convince her. He simply held her a little closer, his hand pressing gently against her side. "Then do not trust me, trust the time. Let every day prove to you that I am not the man I was. Let the days become weeks and the weeks become years, and one morning you will wake up and realize that you have trusted me for so long, you forgot when it started." She closed her eyes. She did not answer, but she did not pull away. They reached the capital on the morning of the 3rd day, the spires of the castle rising against the grey sky, the streets already crowded with merchants and messengers and nobles in fine coats. The Duke had sent word ahead, and a small party of his most trusted servants met them at the city gates, offering fresh horses and clean clothes and a carriage that would carry them through the streets without exposing them to the stares of the crowd. Ilara refused the carriage. "If I am to be seen," she said, "let them see me clearly. Let them see the woman who brought the Duke of Ashworth to his knees in a garden of winter herbs. Let them see the child who has his eyes. Let them see that I am not a secret to be hidden in a carriage." The Duke looked at her with something like awe. He did not argue. He helped her onto the horse, settled Thomas in front of her, and rode beside her through the streets of the capital, his hand never leaving hers, his eyes fixed forward. The whispers started immediately. They spread from the gates to the market square, from the market square to the palace steps, carried by servants and merchants and noblewomen who had nothing better to do than tear apart a story that defied everything they believed about the order of the world. They whispered that the Duke had lost his mind. They whispered that she was a witch. They whispered that the child was not his, that she had tricked him, that he would come to his senses and send her away. But when they reached the palace gates, and the Duke dismounted and helped her down, and he took her hand and walked her up the marble steps with the boy in his other arm, the whispers fell silent. Because no one who saw his face, no one who saw the way he looked at her, could pretend that this was a mistake or a trick or a moment of madness. This was a man who had found something he was not willing to lose. The king received them in a small chamber, not the throne room. It was a room of private audiences, a room where truths were spoken without the weight of 1,000 ears. The king sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, a cup of wine in his hand, his eyes sharp and curious. "So," the king said, looking at Alara, "you are the woman who broke the engagement." She met his gaze without flinching. "I am the woman who carried his child for 9 months and raised him for 3 years without a single word from his father. If that is what it means to break an engagement, then yes, I am that woman." The king's eyebrow rose. He looked at the duke, who stood beside her, his hand still holding hers. "She speaks boldly." "She has earned the right," the duke said. The king was silent for a moment. Then he laughed, a low, rumbling sound that filled the chamber. "I have not heard a woman speak to me like that in 20 years. The court will not know what to do with her." He rose from his chair and walked toward them, stopping in front of the boy, who was hiding behind Alara's skirts. He crouched down, bringing himself to the child's level, and he spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "And what is your name, young man?" Thomas peeked out from behind his mother's leg. "Thomas." "Thomas," the king repeated. "That is a strong name. Do you know who I am?" Thomas shook his head. "I am the king, and you, Thomas, are about to become the most talked-about child in the entire kingdom. Are you ready for that?" Thomas looked at his mother, then back at the king. "Will there be cake?" The king laughed again, louder this time. "There will be cake, I will make sure of it." The king stood and turned to the duke. "You have my blessing, but I want you to know that the road ahead will not be easy. There are those in this court who will never accept her, who will never accept the child, who will see this as a weakness to be exploited. You will have to be strong. You will have to be vigilant. And you will have to choose them every single day, even when it costs you more than you think you can bear." "I understand," the duke said. The king looked at Alara. "And you, take care of him. He is a fool, but he is a fool who has finally learned to love. That is rarer than any title in this kingdom." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. They left the king's chamber with a wedding date set and a future that felt, for the first time, like something they could hold. The duke led her through the winding corridors of the castle, past servants who bowed and nobles who stared, to a suite of rooms that had been prepared for them. It was not the grandest suite. That would come later, when she was his wife. But it was warm and clean and private, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a bed that was soft and wide. She sat on the edge of the bed, Thomas already asleep in her arms, and she looked around the room as if she were afraid it would vanish. The duke knelt before her, his hands on her knees, his eyes searching her face. "You are safe," he said. "You are home." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself fall into that belief, to let it carry her the way the sea carried the boats she had watched from the cliff. But the fear was still there, coiled in her chest, whispering that this was too good to be true, that he would change, that the court would find a way to separate them. "I am afraid," she whispered, the words she had not said until now. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. "So am I, but we will be afraid together, and we will be brave together. And one day we will look back on this moment and realize that it was the moment we stopped running and started living." She closed her eyes. She felt his breath on her lips. She felt the child's weight in her arms. She felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was not alone. And when he kissed her, gently, slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, she did not pull away. The wedding was set for the last day of the king's month. The castle buzzed with preparation, with scandal, with the relentless machinery of a court that had never seen anything like it. The duke did not hide her. He walked with her through the gardens, introduced her to the noble families, held her hand at every dinner, and defied the whispers with the quiet certainty of a man who had nothing to prove. But the whispers did not stop. They grew sharper, more pointed, more dangerous. A group of lords, led by a man named Viscount Aldrich, began to murmur in corners, gathering support for a petition that would challenge the legitimacy of the marriage. They argued that a servant could not become a duchess, that the child was a bastard, that the duke had been manipulated by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The duke heard the rumors. He did not confront them. He waited, watched, and prepared. On the night before the wedding, a letter was slipped under Alara's door. It was written in a fine hand, the ink dark and even, and it contained a single sentence. "The child will never be accepted. Leave before you are destroyed." She read it 3 times. She did not show it to the duke. She folded it, placed it in the fire, and watched it curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. She had survived hunger. She had survived cold. She had survived the cruelty of a man who had once looked at her as if she were nothing. She would not be driven away by a letter from a coward who did not have the courage to sign his name. The next morning she walked down the aisle of the cathedral in a dress of deep blue silk, with winter roses woven into her hair, and she did not look at the faces of the nobles who had come to watch her fall. She looked only at the Duke, who stood at the altar with tears in his eyes and a smile that could have lit the entire kingdom. She reached him. She took his hand. And when the priest asked if she took this man as her husband, she spoke the word loud enough for every ear in the cathedral to hear. Yes. The Duke leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, and whispered the words that would carry her through every storm that followed. You are not beneath me. You have never been beneath me. You are the reason I am standing. She looked at him, and she saw the truth in his eyes, not the polished truth of a duke performing his duty, but the raw, broken, beautiful truth of a man who had finally learned what it meant to love. She smiled. She had heard the words she never thought would come, the Duke's whispered confession that she was not beneath him, that she had always been the reason he stood. If these moments of wounded love slowly healing make your heart ache the way ours does, then subscribe to this channel, because we will keep bringing you stories where pride crumbles and true love finally speaks its name. And tell us in the comments, what was the most powerful, and the kingdom for one breathless moment held its silence. But the silence did not last. It never does in a kingdom built on whispers and ambition. Before the last echo of her vow had faded from the cathedral vault, before the priest had closed his book, a voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Objection. The word ricocheted off the marble columns, striking the congregation like a physical blow. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the pews, and Viscount Aldrich rose from his seat in the front row, his face pale with fury, a parchment unfurling in his trembling hands. On what grounds? The Duke demanded, his voice cold as the winter stone beneath their feet. Aldrich stepped into the aisle, his boots echoing against the floor. On the grounds that this marriage is an offence against the laws of the kingdom, a servant cannot marry into the nobility without the express approval of the Crown Council. Did you seek that approval, my lord? He held up the parchment, his eyes glittering with triumph. I have here a petition signed by 12 lords of the realm, calling for an inquiry into the legitimacy of this union. The Duke did not flinch. He had expected this. He had prepared for this. He released Ilara's hand, stepped forward, and faced the Viscount with a calm that made the older man's confidence waver. You are correct, the Duke said. No servant cannot marry into the nobility without the Crown Council's approval, but the woman you see before you is not a servant. He turned, his eyes finding Ilara's. 3 years ago, before the night that changed everything, before she disappeared, Ilara was granted a pardon by the king himself, a pardon that restored her family's title and lands, a pardon that was sealed and witnessed by the hand of the crown. Ilara's breath caught. She had not known. She stared at the Duke, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of a story she had never been told. Aldrich's face flushed. That is impossible. I have searched the records. There is no such pardon. Because it was never recorded, the king's voice boomed from the front of the cathedral, where he had risen from his seat, his face unreadable. It was a private accord, sealed in my personal chambers, witnessed by my steward and my chaplain. I granted it myself, on the night the Duke came to me with the truth about the child. I restored her family name because she deserved to stand before this court, not as a servant, but as the daughter of a knight who died serving this kingdom. The congregation erupted. Whispers became shouts, shouts became chaos. Aldrich's parchment hung limp in his hands, his petition crumbling into irrelevance. The Duke turned back to Ilara, took her hand, and led her to the altar, where the priest waited with a face that had turned the color of ash. You should have told me, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. I wanted to tell you, he said, but I needed you to walk down this aisle as yourself, not as a title I had given you. I needed the kingdom to see that you did not need a pardon to be worthy. You were worthy the moment you chose to survive. The priest cleared his throat. My lords, my lady, the ceremony is not yet complete. Shall I continue? The Duke looked at Ilara, she looked at him, and she saw in his eyes the man who had knelt in the mud, the man who had ridden through the night, the man who had defied a king and a dozen lords for the woman he loved. Continue, she said. The priest's voice trembled as he spoke the final blessing, but no one was listening. The congregation was too busy watching, too busy judging, too busy trying to decide whether this was a miracle or a scandal. And perhaps it was both. Perhaps every great love story that defied the order of things was a little bit of both a miracle and a scandal. The Duke kissed her, and the cathedral erupted not in applause but in the uncertain, fractured sound of a kingdom trying to decide what it had just witnessed. They walked out of the cathedral together, into the grey winter light, and the crowd that had gathered outside pressed against the guards, straining to catch a glimpse of the woman who had toppled the old order. She held her head high. She held the Duke's hand, and she did not look back at the Viscount, who stood in the doorway, his petition torn in half, his face a mask of defeat. That night in their chambers, with Thomas asleep in the next room and the fire crackling in the hearth, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the king's revelation. "My father was a knight." The Duke was sitting on the edge of the bed, his coat discarded, his shirt open at the collar. He looked up at her, his eyes soft. "Your father was Sir Aldrich of Westmore. He died defending the northern pass during the war with the mountain clans. He saved 300 lives, including the king's. The king never forgot it." She sank into the chair across from him, her hands trembling. "I never knew. My mother died when I was young, and my father never spoke of his past. He was a fisherman when I knew him, a poor fisherman who drowned before I was 10. He was in hiding," the Duke said gently. "He had enemies in the court, men who wanted his lands, his title, his bloodline. He chose to disappear, to raise you in obscurity, to give you a life free from the danger that followed his name. He died before he could tell you the truth." She closed her eyes. The grief she had carried for so long, the grief of a father she barely remembered, suddenly had a shape, a name, a story. She cried, not for the father she had lost, but for the life he had tried to give her, the life she had almost thrown away. The Duke crossed the room and knelt beside her, his hand on her knee. "You are not a servant who trapped a duke. You are the daughter of a knight, the last of a noble line, a woman who has survived more than any person should have to endure. The court will learn your story, and they will learn to respect you." She opened her eyes. "And if they do not? Then they will answer to me." She laughed, a wet, broken sound. "You cannot fight an entire court. Watch me," he said, and the smile that spread across his face was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. They sat together as the fire burned low, talking about the future, about Thomas, about the estate that would need to be rebuilt, about the allies they would need to gather and the enemies they would need to neutralize. She was not naive enough to believe that the scandal would fade, but she was strong enough to face it, with him beside her. Days turned into weeks. The Duke spent his mornings in the council chamber, fighting battles of ink and influence. Ilara spent her days learning the rhythms of the castle, earning the trust of the servants, winning the cautious respect of the nobility who had come to watch her fail. She did not try to charm them. She simply was herself, resilient, sharp, unbreakable, and slowly, inch by inch, she won them over. Thomas grew, his legs stretching, his voice deepening, his eyes taking in the world with the wonder of a child who had never known he was born into a war. He played in the gardens, chased the palace cats, learned his letters from the chaplain, and asked his father every night before sleep why the Viscount had tried to stop the wedding. The Duke answered him honestly, as he would an equal. "Because he was afraid, Thomas. Afraid of losing what he had. Afraid of the change we represented. Fear makes people do terrible things." Thomas considered this. "Are you afraid?" "Every day," the Duke said. "But I am more afraid of losing your mother than of anything the Viscount can do to me." Thomas nodded, satisfied with the answer, and fell asleep with his head on his father's shoulder. It was a peace, not a victory. The threats were never fully extinguished. Viscount Aldrich retreated into the shadows, nursing his wounded pride, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Letters of complaint arrived at the castle, some from distant lords, some from the king's own advisers. The Duke read them, burned them, and continued. But one evening a messenger arrived with a letter that made the Duke's face go pale. He read it twice, folded it, and placed it in his pocket without saying a word. Ilara found him in the study later, staring at the fire. "What did the letter say?" He did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. "Aldrich is dead, found in his chambers this morning. The physician says it was poison." She felt the cold grip of dread tighten around her heart. "Who would do such a thing?" "I don't know, but the rumors are already spreading. They say I did it. They say I ordered his death to silence him." She crossed the room and took his hand. "Did you?" He looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "No, but I cannot prove it. I have enemies on every side, and they are using this, Ilara. They are using his death to destroy us." She held him, the fire crackling beside them, the weight of the kingdom pressing down on their shoulders. The road ahead was not going to be easy. It was never going to be easy. But they had faced worse. They had faced hunger, cold, loneliness, and each other at their worst. They could face this. She pressed her lips to his cheek. "Then we will fight it together." And in the shadows beyond the window, a figure watched, its face unreadable, its hand still stained with the ink of a letter that had sealed Aldrich's fate. The game was not over. It was only just beginning.